Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 66 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. My name is Mark, and with me, as always, are my fellow co-hosts, Neelan and Kellen.
Hello.
I thought you were going to introduce yourself as Satan.
Oh, the 6-6. I mean...
That's only 2 out of 3 of us, then.
Yeah. I thought like the actual mark of the beast wasn't 666 and it's actually some other thing.
I feel like there's some sort of like it was a mistranslation or something like that. Yeah, I've heard this too.
Have you read the Bible?
Before we go on, we've got huge news. We have been invited to Shucks 2019 in beautiful Vancouver, Canada. Woo!
Yeah. That's awesome.
This is not a joke.
Yes.
If you go,
believe it or not.
Yeah. We're not just inviting ourselves.
If you go on Shut Up and Sit Down's website,
yes,
you will see our tank logos in full 3D. No, not 3D.
Yep.
High definition glory.
Color.
And details are still forthcoming, but we know that we'll be doing a podcast record live.
And this coincided with them putting their tickets on sale, so go ahead and check that out. And yeah, if you want to come,
we would love for you to come.
Yeah, that's going to be the first weekend in October in Vancouver. I've heard so many great things about Shucks, a convention to play board games, so I'm super excited to just play board games a lot. And meanwhile, I'm going to be working on the script for these two, so they don't say anything dumb live.
That is the pot... not calling the kettle black. What is the analogy I'm going here? The very black pot being concerned about the gray kettle.
It is exactly what happened. Neelan started a list of things I can't say live at Shucks, and they just keep adding to it. It's a Google Doc. It's horrifying.
It now just says in capital letters, don't say anything.
That's right. On today's show, we are going to be discussing strategies, specifically optimal strategies, what we think of games that have them, whether they're perceived or real, and if they're real, and if they're real to the point where maybe they're considered broken, what that makes us think about those games, what we think about overpowered quote-unquote strategies and dominant strategies in games that have them. Does that affect our feeling about those games or gaming in general? Yeah, so...
Stop using the Loki strategy against me in Blood Rage. I don't want to play against it.
If it works, it works.
That's the subtitle, right, for the episode?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Perfect.
That's what we're going to get into as our main topic. But before we do, we're going to do what we always do, and that's talk about the games we've played this week. So, Neelan, what have you been playing?
Wait, I have a public service announcement.
Neelan, do the public service announcement.
Oh, good.
Siren?
It was brought to our attention on our Discord, which you can access at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, that I did not learn how to play Push correctly.
It's got a huge rule book, though, right?
It's got a 2-page rule book, and then I taught all you yuck fucks how to play it incorrectly, and then we talked about it on the air to thousands of people.
So I'm wiping my loss in that game, officially on the log.
So a Push is a small card game that is supposed to be sort of an Uno replacement. You're pushing your luck on your turn and between your turn. It's very fun. It's very silly. I erroneously said that each card was worth 1 point, when in reality each card is worth the value of the card itself, which only increases my opinion of the game. This leads to more tactical decisions on your turn because sometimes one card is worth more than a pile of 4 cards. We played this at Mark's birthday party this past weekend, and people were screaming and shouting. Gamers, non-gamers, everybody took a turn on Push.
Taught this to a number of non-gamers, and they all had a lot of fun with it. The scoring rules as printed make the game even more fun than it already is. So yeah, it's a great game.
And I'll never be trusted again.
That's right.
To read the rules. My master plan.
But Neil, before you were so rudely interrupted.
Yeah, any more public service announcements before I
messed up?
Say anything?
I mean, if this is the first one that makes it to air, everyone has missed about 50 of these things.
Okay, let's talk about Norwegians. This is the first major expansion for A Feast for Odin. There was a mini expansion that just added a couple of exploration islands, but I actually never played that. But this is a relatively big box. It's about half the size of the original box, and it's got a bunch of new stuff in it. It's got a whole new worker placement board, which completely replaces the original, which is now this modular design that sort of varies by player count. So the spaces sort of get reduced or increased based on how many players you're playing, which if you've played A Feast for Odin, you know that there are a bunch of spaces available at every player count. And if you're playing at 2 or 3 players, it sometimes feels like too many options are available sometimes. For example, the whaling option, there are 2 actions for this on the original board, and at 2 or 3 players on the new board, it gets reduced to a single space. So suddenly it's a little bit more competitive in what is seen as a fairly strong action. It substantially changes some of the actions on the board as well. So some of the things where you would rely on getting food for your feast in some ways on the original board aren't there anymore in the expansion, in ways that actually feel pretty substantially different. So when we played this, there are actions and sort of strategies that I was not reliant on, but was expecting to be there, and there suddenly weren't. It also adds 2 new animals to the game. So there are now pigs and horses. Pigs breed slightly faster. There are these artisan sheds that you get dealt at the start of the game, which are like the starting occupations, little specific sort of starting strategies that you can work towards and build like you would a shed in that game. So there's just a bunch of little updates to it that don't really substantially add to the rule set. One of the things that kind of surprised me about this is that almost everyone I've sort of spoken to about this has said that they just go straight into the expansion, even with new players, and they don't find that their sort of appreciation or their ability to learn the game is hurt by it. In a lot of ways, I've seen people describe this as more of an update to the game versus an expansion, to the extent that I don't think I would necessarily even play it without the expansion.
Right. I mean, for a game like Feast for Odin, where like the board of worker placement spots is like the game. It's like the anchor of the game. And for that to be replaced whole cloth with the boards in the expansion, it is sort of like undeniably an updating of the game. You're gutting the main part of it and you're
totally.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you have to imagine that there's been a lot of thought and consideration that's gone into what actions got removed, which ones got replaced, what they got replaced with. One of the things that's pretty interesting is there's a whole 5th column added to the board, which are actions that you can only take if you're ending your turn in order to take them. It gives us this extra edge of competition because there are these powerful spaces that you're not rushing to compete for, but if you don't get to them early, they might not be there by the time you get to the end of your turn. So that in itself is an interesting little element. It's still a really solid game. It's one that I hadn't played in a long time until the 3 of us played it. I'm curious to check in with the 2 of you. You guys have only played it once before, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
So what was your sort of gut take on Norwegians?
How do you feel about paying $50 for balance changes to a game you already own?
Pretty good. No, look, it's a game I love. It's weird when you start to frame it from the perspective of like, oh, people say this is the 1.2 patch to Feast for Odin, and that is weird. You're paying a healthy chunk for a game that is almost like the fixed version of the main game. But, it seems so... At the same time as I would recommend it, the base game is great. I really, really enjoyed A Feast for Odin, and I think the expansion is substantially better. So if you've sort of played it out to this point, or played it a lot, it felt like a little bit of like a reinvigoration. It was just what I needed to sort of like get me excited about playing Feast for Odin again, which is a game that I'd sort of fallen off of just over time, just because other games come out. So yeah, it's one I would definitely recommend if you're a fan of the game. I don't think it's necessarily one that if it's been a long time since you played A Feast for Odin and you're not necessarily itching to play it again, it's not one I would rush out to go and buy. But if you're a fan of the game, it's one I would definitely recommend.
It won't fundamentally alter the experience.
No, exactly. Right. You're still playing A Feast for Odin.
I do think that we'll be coming back here. The feature topics that we end up with are always sort of what's ruminating in our heads. And I think I have some thoughts on A Feast for Odin, specifically in games with a lot of different strategies that we'll come back to. But for me, for my second play, I think I cooled a little bit on A Feast for Odin. The first play, I think Neelan sort of half-begged, half-asked me to play, and I agreed to, and he was sort of apologizing the whole time. and I left the game going, there's fun elements to this, even though it's way too multiplayer solitaire overall. And what Norwegians does is it made the board a little bit more cutthroat for the worker placement actions, which I definitely appreciate. So if I were to play Feast for Odin again, I would definitely want to play it with that updated board. There's no question. But the reality is 99% of your game is solitaire. You don't really care what anyone's doing. There were a couple turns where it mattered. Turn order definitely matters, where you want to make sure you're going first in a subsequent round. But this is all about a sandbox style game where you are trying to be the most efficient in building a Tetris puzzle, in your corner of the galaxy.
Right.
Yeah, and I can't disagree with any of that. I think there are a couple of turns where someone would steal an action right before you, and, that's a thing. But in the game that's 3 hours long, it didn't feel that substantial. I will reiterate that the multiplayer solitaire nature in general is not something that typically bothers me about it.
I liked it. I did feel a little cooler upon playing it this time than the last time. I'm not exactly sure why, because I think Norwegians is a better game, even though I like Feast for Odin. This did feel like a 1.2 version. I think it was the opacity of knowing where I stood scoring wise during the game. Like, it felt to me, because there are so many options, there's so many ways to get points, and obviously, like Feast for Odin, you have the idea of covering up negative spots to erase negative points, and therefore, scoring points in a way. I just didn't feel like I knew where I stood until the final tally was up. I felt like I lost a little bit there. Like, I didn't know if I should be chasing. I didn't know if I was second place or third place or first place or what. Just not having a handle there for some reason felt like I was just like inputting, and then we'll see where it winds up.
Evaluating the result. Yeah, and that's fair. I think that's, to some extent, that's a larger criticism of long, heavy Euro games, right?
I don't know about that. I think there are heavy Euro games where the standings are a little more apparent.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, but it is. I'm arguing against, like, sort of the reason I like Feast for Odin.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I can't have one without the other. I do like the various pathways in Feast for Odin, the islands and the whaling and all the different avenues of scoring is like an intriguing aspect. But for some reason, just not getting my hands around where the current game state was.
Just where everyone's points were coming from. Because that is something that always ends up being surprising. It's like, where did you, how did you even do that? And if that's not apparent after having played a game with someone for 3 hours, that does feel a little bit weird, right?
Right. But I would definitely, to be clear, I would definitely play it again happily. Yeah, for sure.
I can definitely understand that criticism for sure. That is the Norwegians.
I've been ruminating on a joke about how I've never felt further away from you guys after spending 3 hours together at the table. We were so far apart at the table because we didn't even have to speak, except for me to go, Nealon, what does this do? About 60 times.
Another game we played together this weekend, actually at Kubla Now, the sort of expansion con for the Kubla Con in San Francisco. They've had their first satellite con, which was in Burbank this weekend, was a game by the one and only, what do you call him?
The only true and living doctor.
Yes. Reiner Knizia. This is Lost Cities Rivals, which is a follow-up, or this is the successor to his masterpiece, one of his many masterpieces, Lost Cities. We played this 3-player, whereas Lost Cities is a 2-player game. And this is a pretty pure auction game. There's a big set collection element to it, and there's also a big press your luck element to it. But what you're doing in Lost Cities Rivals is there are 5 colors, which correspond to suits in this game. And every turn you are doing one of two things. You're either top decking and adding a card to the array, or you are starting an auction on the cards in the array. And whoever wins the auction can take any number of cards from the array that they want, put it into a tableau, and if they would like, they can burn one card from the array. The way that scoring works is you must play the cards sequentially on your tableau in the row assigned to their color. So you can have a maximum of 5 columns in your tableau, one for every color. And you're playing cards going from 2 to 10. There are fewer cards of the higher numbers, so I think there's just 1 10 card, for example. And you're playing them in, again, sequential order. So once you play, for example, a 7 blue, you can never play a 6 or under blue, making those cards less valuable to you. In addition, before playing any numerical cards of a suit, you can play these, I think they're called expedition cards. They're basically multiplier cards. And what you're doing there is you're basically adding the multiplier to that column. So if I haven't played anything in the red column, for example, and I win an auction that has one of these red multiplier cards, I can add it to that row, making it go from scoring as normally, like 1 times, to scoring 2 times. And then if I want to wait and add another one of those multiplier cards, I can. But again, once I start committing numerical cards to any column, which is where you're getting your points, then you can no longer add one of these multiplier cards. So it's a balance between how long am I going to hold out and try to add as many multipliers as possible, before sort of jumping into actually producing points on these columns. And the game moves pretty quick. You're basically going through the deck once. When the auction comes up, you're bidding with money that is every fourth of the game. Any spent money by all the players is as equally as possible divided back to the players. So there's some reclamation of money every fourth way through the game. I really enjoyed it. What did you guys think of it?
I liked it a lot. I really enjoy Lost Cities as a two-player game. So I was actually kind of surprised that aside for the basic element of assembling the expeditions in numeric order, this didn't really give me the same feel of Lost Cities that much. One of the strongest elements of the two-player game for me is this idea that you can push your luck, if I remember correctly, and that you sort of invest in these columns, but those columns could turn into be negative points in the two-player game. So you might be sort of push really, really hard in the column and then get punished for it at the end. That doesn't happen in Rivals. Like every column is positive, and the push your luck is, like you were saying, how far are you willing to push your multipliers before you start actually netting points? Because if you wait too long, all those cards are going to other players. So it becomes much more of almost of like a pure auction game to some extent. On your turn, you're playing a card or starting an auction. And I like that a lot. I haven't played that many pure auction games, and this one I really, really liked. It made me sort of feel like I would really like to try Ra, for example. I guess is the most renowned auction game. But that said, Lost Cities, I enjoy this. It played very quickly. It's very simple to explain, and it was just satisfying.
Yeah.
Repeated auctions is always just a fun mechanic to me.
It seemed like a Knizia classic, everything stripped down, and basically you're just getting to the essence of the auction, more or less.
Yeah, I played this multiple times actually over the weekend at 3 and 4 player counts and really enjoyed it. I think it punches above its weight. I think you can get through a 3-player game in probably 20 minutes once you know how to do it, but feels substantially heavier than that. You know, we talk about Ra, but Ra is 45 minutes probably. And this is a small deck of cards and a couple of chits. And it also plays 2 to 4. I think there is some of that screw you in it that is inherent in Lost Cities. You know, like, you are pressing your luck, certainly, but you're also desperately hoping that your opponent isn't hiding the cards that you need, you know, and so by declaring an investment or an expedition in red, your opponents don't want to give you red anymore. And that carries over from Lost Cities to Lost Cities Rivals because, you know, you're frequently auctioning 8 cards, but you only want 2 of them. But no one else wants to spend any money because you're very poor, so you win that for two coins. You know, no one can bid more than 2 coins. You take 2 of them, you're like, well, I'll take a third one. And then it's just like, who can I the most?
Yeah, right.
And then you look around and you pick up the card and look them in the eye and then toss it into the box.
Right.
And so those moments were great for everything except my relationship.
Yeah, a lot of times there was an auction going on where I didn't care what the other players took as long as they didn't burn this specific card. Like, I don't care who wins this auction. I don't care what cards you take. Just leave this one alone, you know? And that burning one card is such like a really
that's a really nice
twist.
Little touch.
That's like a perfect Knizia addition, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. So that is Lost Cities Rivals by the one and only true living doctor, except for Dr. Finn. Kellen, what did you play?
So I wanted to start and end where we began with Doctor. No, he's not a doctor. Uwe Rosenberg.
So this is a Rosenberg sandwich with Knizia in the middle? Knizia meat?
My cheeks are burning. I'm looking down at the floor. So, you know, Uwe Rosenberg can't stop making puzzle games with tetraminos.
Yeah, but I think both works.
And so
Nealon knows the real one, but he's
I honestly I would say tetramino, but I feel like other people would say tetramino.
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah, it's exactly. I think it's probably as tetramino to rhyme with domino.
Ah.
There you go.
So we were able to play this past week a game that I am very glad and happy to help the barragers. I don't know that we've ever figured that out. To help our listeners save money so that they can have a second chance to pay their mortgage or anything else. We played a game by Uwe Rosenberg called Second Chance. This is a stripped down roll and write game. Even the box, they couldn't afford to pay for illustrations in color, so a lot of it is in black and white. So in Second Chance, you have a grid of boxes, and 2 cards are flipped over, and then everyone at the table chooses one of those shapes and must draw it on their grid. Then you do that again, and again, until you get close to the end of the game and your grid is mostly filled in. And then if you can't do either of the two shapes, you get an extra card. And that card is your second chance. And if you can fill that shape in, you're still in the game. And if not, you're out of the game. The winner of the game is whoever's filled in the most squares, ultimately meaning if you last the longest, you have the most likely chance of having done that, but you get eliminated from the game the second you can't complete your second chance. That is the entirety of the game. In our first game of Second Chance, I think there were 3 or 4 of us out of 8, 6, 7, or 8 who were all neck and neck at the very end. And then we all got second chances at the same time. And some of us got second chances with 7 pieces in them. And some of us got second chances with 2 pieces in them. And then the player with 2 pieces in them won the game. Congratulations. Is it you, Neelan?
It was me.
Congratulations, Neelan, on
you.
your second chance.
Yeah.
This just does not do enough. I get it. It was pleasant. I feel like Neelan is going to try to half-ass defend it here.
It will definitely be sort of a half-ass defend because I can't disagree with anything you're saying. I would definitely not recommend anyone buy this game. That said, it is pleasant, and I found it a satisfying way to fill 10 minutes. The barrier to entry is like as low as it could possibly be. You give someone a sheet of paper and a pencil, and then you say, draw one of these shapes on your grid every.
Speaking of like a pleasant way to pass 10 minutes, my biggest complaint, I think about it, would be how long it took. Maybe it was just the way our card draws were sort of like leaning towards the smaller shapes.
Yeah.
But I felt like we just kept filling in shapes and filling in shapes and filling in shapes. And I felt like it took a long time, longer than I would have sort of liked for the game like this to get to the like second chances being
right. Well, 2 points on that is that, yeah, I do think we sort of, for whatever reason, our deck was weighted to getting big shapes right towards the end. Secondly, everyone was making patterns on their tiles for half of the game.
Actually, the box cover, Neelan, basically tells you to do that.
You have to do that?
Because they couldn't afford the color, Neelan.
That's fair. Right. The funny thing was looking at everyone's sheet at the end of the game, and everyone has these, smiley faces in their tiles or swirlies, and you guys were like competing over spiral patterns that you stole from each other.
He stole from me.
Yeah.
We make everything fun, Neelan.
I agree. That was the best part of the game. The one thing I will feel like I have to counter is that the idea of the second chance, right? It is your second chance. Like if you've gotten to the second chance, you're just about to be eliminated. So it should feel a little bit lucky for you to stay in. Like the idea that we all got to that point and we all drew second chances and some of us more lucky than others, that felt edge casey to me.
Well, you would hope that the game was hard enough that
exactly.
Some people would get eliminated
sooner than later. Yeah.
Correct.
Exactly. And that's where I'm not convinced it's a great design because you're almost inclined to always just pick the biggest shape and draw that. So everyone is kind of roughly at the same spot at the same point in the game. So it didn't feel like, as you would expect from a roll and write, that there was that much variance at the table.
Kellen brought this up while we were playing, the argument that we had a couple rounds, and I think we only had 2 rounds where people called for second chances. But when multiple people call for second chances in the same round, they're all given, as Kellen just mentioned, different cards. I don't know what the argument would be against everybody having to draw the same card. That feels like it would mitigate that sort of unfairness. Like, why not just have everybody have that same second chance?
I mean, I'd be curious to try it that way, to be honest.
Yeah. It just would seem more fair because it is, if you get a second chance and you, like Kellen said, have a 7 block second chance versus somebody else having a single block, it seems like...
Yeah, that did seem repeatedly weird. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, listen, the concept, the idea of it, I love. It's like this battle royale of Tetris. Right. Exactly. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, be the last one left. And like, here's my prayer,
Right.
But God doesn't listen to your second chances. I don't know. It just...
It's funny, right? Because like you want to argue for the distillation of ideas into their simplest forms, but this almost felt too far, right? Like we all said at the end that it barely felt like a game so much as, oh, we just did a thing for 10 minutes, which I don't know.
I wouldn't mind playing again to see how it holds up the second play.
I've got to be honest. Like,
even having played,
I did play it a second time, and it was a pleasant way to pass time. Okay. I'm not going to argue against it. I've said.
Did you have
before,
a significantly different experience in terms of like just
I wouldn't say so. I won again, so I mean, it felt pretty good.
Yeah.
But like I think last week's episode established I really like this style of game, and it works for me just as a way to sort of occupy my brain.
You only have so many minutes left in your life.
Right, exactly.
And perfectly pleasant is damning.
Oof.
Your real life won't give you a second chance.
Wow.
All right, so that will do for the Rosenberg burger with Knizia in the middle. Somebody on Discord draw that and put it on the Discord. Rosenberg sandwich, Knizia in the middle. I want to see it. Before we move on to our feature topic, I just want to reiterate that one of the best things you can do for the show if you enjoy it is to review us, be it on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Facebook or wherever you find us. Go ahead and give us a review. We love reading them. We love getting them. They really help out the show. And when we get them, we will read them, as I will be doing right now. So this review is titled, Let Your Ears Be Barraged with Awesome. And this comes from a French-looking name, I'm going to say, in my perfect French, Métier de Guy Foxe, which I think is French for...
classy gentleman.
That's right. That's right. So here he goes. If you are a board gamer of any level, you need to listen to these guys. They have great interaction and humor, and they have a fresh take on the board gaming hobby. So far, I'm on board with everything he's saying. All three hosts have different likes, dislikes, and you will find one that you can relate to and find new games from. Everything's great. Which would be the red tank? And this is where the review falls off the cliff.
Yeah.
Wow, what a classy gentleman.
Also, where else would you hear about a game like Hundreds of Horses? Go listen now. And we can all agree to that part of it, although there was that problematic sentence in the middle. Yeah, but nobody's perfect except all the Green Tank fans out there. But moving on, thank you, Miet de Guy Foxe, for that mostly wonderful review. And again, please review us wherever you find us. We really, really appreciate it. Okay, so let's now move on to our feature discussion, which is generally about strategies. So we're all here obviously fans of strategy board games, as they're often called. So we're obviously acknowledging that games have strategies. And if a game has strategies, there are often a number of strategies that can be employed. And you sometimes hear about games that have dominant strategies, overpowered strategies, all the way to broken strategies, you know? So as a jumping off point, if a game had an optimal strategy, how would that affect your interest in the game?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here first with a public service announcement. Now, I think that a lot of the love of board gaming is the discovery, is the first 10 plays where you're trying to figure out how to make something happen. You know, a game like A Feast for Odin is just a sandbox. There's so many options, so many paths to victory. And if I were to find out, you know, in A Feast for Odin that whaling was overpowered and needed to be nerfed in the Norwegians in order to bring it back into balance, that's a little bit troubling. Yeah. I think there's a fundamental assumption when you play a Euro game that has 10 different stratagems or strategies or things that you can focus on, that those are relatively well balanced, and that obviously the winner is going to be the person who best does multiple tracks.
Right.
I think, you know, you can go too far down this road. You know, I think the most famous example in modern board gaming design is the Halifax Hammer,
right?
Which is the name of a strategy in a game called A Few Acres of Snow.
Right.
And this strategy, if one player uses it, they automatically win. They can't lose. Yeah. So it's not even a degenerate strategy. It's not even a strategy that you have to look out for. Another great example of a strategy is the Loki strategy in Blood Rage. In Blood Rage, you're drafting cards, and one of those sets of cards helps you score victory points for losing battles, which is hard to jive with. It's hard to understand, but it's also hard to deal with.
Right.
Now, that strategy, mostly in tournament play, seems to not be overpowered. From a perception standpoint, it's very annoying and difficult to deal with. So sometimes it feels overpowered, and it's kind of annoying to newer players. And so that difference, right, between the Halifax Hammer as something that is obviously degenerate and broken is something that would make me not want to play the game. And in fact, if that existed in a game, I probably wouldn't play the game. I mean, because it gets back to that argument, right, sometimes where we talk about, are you making the fun move or are you making the optimal move?
Right.
Because if you and I are playing A Few Acres of Snow, my God, you're going to pad your win rate by just using the Halifax Hammer. And so it's hard to say, you know, in the competitive spirit, to say, well, just don't use that strategy. It's kind of like, well...
Yeah, I hate that argument. Before we actually dive into that, Neil, what do you...
It's interesting because a lot of this comes down to, like you're saying, about the idea of perception versus actuality. Because, like, the idea that in the example of A Few Acres for Snow, you're saying that that is a legitimate solved strategy, right? Like, that exists and is undeniably broken. Then that's obviously, like, the most extreme version of this. Just as a terrible bad example, like tic-tac-toe is famously solved. There are definitely these examples of games that you can algorithmically define a path to winning that is unbeatable. And that extends sort of slightly to Eurogames, because it's easy to imagine in something like A Feast for Odin, where almost every element has a mathematical value to it, right? The silver is worth a point, and every tile covers a certain amount of spaces, so it's technically worth a certain number of points. You're trading in resources that are worth a certain number of points to get resources of another type of value of points, and you're weighing that against the cost in workers. So everything can theoretically have a very precise mathematical value, to the extent that you could find the actions that are the most powerful. You could find the paths and the strategies that are numerically the most powerful. And that's technically, theoretically true, but also immediately uninteresting if anyone was to actually pursue one of those strategies. It's this bizarre thing, because you would want to hope that under most circumstances, no one would be aware of or able to employ that sort of level of rigor to determine these. But the second you go on to the internet, these things are widely available, right? There's this very worrying thing where for any given game, these strategies can sort of float to the top. Magic the Gathering, for example, is plagued by this with net decking, where the optimal way to play that game is to find the decks that are perceived as broken over thousands of plays and build that deck. That's a boring way to play Magic the Gathering if you're a group of friends, but it's unarguably the best way to play it. I think a lot of this, like you were saying, Kevin, it just boils down to how you're willing to play among a group of friends, right?
Right. I mean, it strikes me that, for me at least, when I'm perceiving these argument of strategies, they sort of fall into three sort of buckets. There's the strong / overpowered strategy, where I sort of think of the Loki strategy, where it seems to be almost inarguably built into the game as designed. It's sort of working as designed, is how I sort of feel about it. It may be overpowered, but the intent is not altered.
Yeah, perhaps it's easier to hate draft against it.
Right.
It's something that you must deal with if someone is going to go there.
Right. Maybe the designer doesn't see how difficult it is to counter, especially for novice players, you know? So that's one bucket. The other bucket is the tic-tac-toe Connect 4, where it's a solved game. It's a game where there is a way to win it if you are the first player or whatever. There's a way to, extend it. So that seems to be the other bucket. And then the third one is the Few Acres of Snow, Halifax Hammer, where it seems like a bug. It seems like an error in the game. Like, it's neither a true strategy as intended, and is not a game that is solved, but it is a fixable thing. Do you see the shades there, or do they both fall into the same thing for you?
I feel like I'd have to know more about the problems with tic-tac-toe and Connect 4. Because Connect 4, you can't auto-win, you just can auto-tie, right?
Well, yeah, and tic-tac-toe is the same way, is that if you're the second player, you can always force a draw at the very least. I believe. I might have that switch somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think Wallace has...
He's changed it.
Right. Another Wallace game, the original version of London, had overpowered to the point of being bugs in the game, where there were two clear overpowered strategies or overpowered cards, and that was acknowledged by Wallace, I believe, and fixed in London, the second edition.
So do we think that this is like the desired approach for designers to sort of handle this sort of problem? Because you mentioned A Feast for Road, and I don't know enough about whaling in the original game to know if it is overbalanced, but this idea that Norwegians sort of patches this change, right? Or Mon Wallace releases an update to the game that fixes this problem. Right. Is that desirable? Because I know a lot of designers that will sort of lean on and say, oh, no, I mean, we know this exists, but you just find your own way to work around it.
It's really weird to me because, I mean, just to talk about the two Wallace games, like, I never played the first edition London, and one of the reasons was I heard that there were these imbalances, this brokenness to it. But I was very eager to play the second edition of London, and I really enjoyed it when I did play it. There hasn't been a reprint or an official fix for A Few Acres of Snow, but I have no interest in playing it, even though I don't know the nuances of the Halifax Hammer, just to know enough about it to know where to target. Even if there was like Wallace said, okay, the way to fix it is to take these cards out or to do this, that still doesn't feel like enough to me. Like, that still feels like a broken game.
Pare it back a little. I think you said something interesting there, and we all kind of talked before we recorded. We spend virtually no time on the strategy sections of Board Game Geek intentionally.
Right.
We started playing Great Western Trail for the first time. And in that game, it feels like there are really 3 strategies that you can pursue. And obviously, there's more than that. This is dumbing it down.
Right.
You can get a good deck of cows. You can move your train super far along the track, or you can have the best fleet of workers and or buildings, I
right.
guess.
Yeah.
And about halfway through the game, honestly, literally halfway through the game, I remembered hearing someone else or another podcast or a blog article or something say that the game became balanced for one of the underpowered strategies in the expansion.
Right.
And so even on my first play of Great Western Trail, I was like, oh, that's a sucker's game. I'm not going to do that thing.
Right.
And I'm not repeating that thing here because I actually don't know if it's true. And in some ways, like, that's the joy of discovery. You know, if I tell you, hey, you should do this, this, and this, you know, if this podcast episode was us going through all of our games and saying this is the most overpowered strategy, I feel like we'd be depriving the audience of the joy of these games.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And what's interesting is, like, as a peek behind the curtain, is that was our initial, like, angle into this episode, was sort of looking up games and sort of trying to find some examples of games that we thought had broken strategies. And very quickly into that process, it became apparent that there's no actual joy to be derived from sort of even talking about that, right? Because even just if this sort of devolves into, oh, here's this game I love, and I read about all these broken strategies for it, and that's not interesting for me as someone that loves those games. That's not interesting for anyone to sort of hear about us talking about them.
But they shouldn't exist.
And then that's exactly my point, right? That's the thing that's so frustrating, is that, like, because then the corollary to that is that this knowledge is out there and people are aware of it, and that in itself is just so hugely frustrating to me.
See, I don't blame that for existing. I don't know. People who love these games, who are going to play these games like 100 times and find these strategies, I just think that's natural and right, for lack of a better term, that they discuss it and it's out there. I mean, that's not, for lack of a better term, their fault.
Sure, but I mean, there's a difference between sort of like discovering and discussing those things
Yeah.
naturally in a small community, right? There's something very weird about the multiplicity of the internet that is just like, you just have instant access to all this stuff without
Right.
the work,
Yeah.
without the investment.
And I mean, this really relates to my experiences with chess as a child, you know, and as a teenager and an adult. Like, I enjoyed chess a lot as a kid. And the more I was given a book, I think in high school, which was sort of like, here are the 50 best chess openings. And just even that made me go, wait, what? You know, my games of chess, I was just loving that tactical
Spontaneity.
battle and fighting back and forth. And then, you know, when you start reading about the advantage that white has over black inherently, you know, and then you multiply, like Neelan is talking about just humans helping each other on the internet, but now we've injected AI into this conversation, and, you know, the AI is basically better at chess, is better at Go, or close to better at Go, and that means that those things are closer to solvable, or perhaps just beyond our comprehension, and that kind of makes me think they're not.
Yeah, I understand. It's tough. I will say one thing that was interesting like reaction that I felt when you mentioned that tournament Blood Rage, which is a thing that I didn't even know existed, has shown that the Loki strategy is maybe not in fact overpowered. I instantly, as soon as you said that, felt better about the game. Just knowing that even this strategy that I had heard so much, I mean, I've employed it in a game, but that I'd heard so much was overpowered to the point where I was sort of souring on certainly playing that strategy and Blood Rage in general. Hearing that in high-level competition, it's not, makes me feel better about the game, and that's an interesting sort of instant evaluation.
Yeah, I think there's another example. There is a faction in Cthulhu Wars called the Chocho, and I'm sure I'm butchering the Cthulhu pronunciation, but who cares? And it's a turtling defensive faction that was overpowered and has since been nerfed. And the designer of the game is basically like, only noobs lose to Chocho now, deal with it. And I would say probably the community is split 50-50, saying, no, dude, this faction is still broken. And him going, LOL, like, don't be a noob. And it's just the perception of dealing with that faction makes you just want to put it away, or
Right.
put that faction away, or not play that game anymore. It's very intriguing.
It does become like this really sort of dark road you can go down, because one of the things that I will do is, if I play a game and I sort of have this sense, oh, it did seem like someone was dominating with a specific strategy, I don't necessarily look up counters, but I do like to sort of gauge BGG and be like, is it widely regarded that this is dominant? And often you'll find that the first couple of replies will be, no. I mean, look, it might seem that on your first game of it, but once you've played it 2 or 3 times, you'll see that there's this and this and that. And I love that. I love this idea that there are always these examples of games that people will play and instantly think they've figured out after one game, only to be countered by people that have played it a few more times. And whether that is a perception thing or reality is debatable. Because the counter to that is then have to then, every time you play the game subsequently with someone, say, oh, this may seem overpowered,
don't worry about
but don't worry about it. And then that itself is also weird, right? Because you don't want to have to present that much upfront information before anyone's played the game at all. It's weird.
So let me ask you this, friends. You didn't laugh. The friends, anyway. So in a Euro game, like pull it back philosophically, is it designed, if there are 5 tracks that everyone is moving down, do all 5 of those tracks need to be balanced for you, or would it be okay if one of them was actually better than the other 4 tracks?
It's fine for me if one of them is better than the other 4, as long as it's not easily perceptible or easily exploitable. Maybe that's a dodge. I see by the facial reaction that you see that as a dodge. But I mean, if I play the game 2 or 3 times and one strategy seems to be stronger than the other, it doesn't even have to be dominant, just clearly stronger than the other ones, and I can't figure a way out, or if I decide to look it up and it seems that people are saying, yeah, this is maybe not a killer strategy, but it's a clearly one of the stronger one or the strongest one, that would bother me.
I actually take the opposite tack to that, which is my read is that I would rather have a game where it's obvious that the thing is stronger, so that everyone is aware of it quicker and sort of able to work around that, right? Like, you don't want the situation where a path is stronger, but it's not apparent that it is, but maybe one person clues into that and it only becomes revealed over the long term of playing that game.
I guess, but so you're saying you want it to be obvious so that everybody knows it's out there and can counter it from
right,
the beginning?
Exactly. So that the countering of that stronger track is immediately a part of the game you're playing.
Right.
Sooner rather than bearing out over the long course of time and research, which feels like the most egregious case to me.
And that was my Feast for Odin thought, was that there's no way all of these disparate strategies are balanced, but no one's ever going to know because there's 800 different options.
Right.
But it's okay if you don't know, as long as you don't perceive that, in fact, this one strategy is the best. And then I'm like, well, is this a game?
Well, there is something rewarding, and there's something that should be rewarded, in my opinion, for sussing out the strongest strategy. If a game has a strongest strategy, but it's not clear, and you're the person to figure it out, there's something you should win that game.
Yeah, I guess is the game the discovery of the game or the employing of strategies and tactics to outmaneuver your friends, right? Because the game, for me, is not discovering which of these 5 options is the best. I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So finish that, because for me, the reward of the game is figuring it out. It's not.
But then so essentially you're answering the thesis question that can a game have an optimal strategy? Is that okay? And it is 100% for you.
Well, what I'm saying is, if there is an optimal strategy, I don't want it to be clear right away. I want it to be something that is maybe figured out on the 10th try or the 15th game. And in that case, the player or players who have figured out that this is the way to go, I don't have a problem with them winning most of those games, because that's the reward for figuring out that's the best strategy. I mean, it still, for me, feels like
or for reading Board Game Geek.
Sure, you could read Board Game Geek and say you didn't read it, and then
like studying for the Mensa test.
Right, which is impossible to do.
I mean, I guess this relates to me is very interesting. We've, I believe, talked before about whether we're interested in reading strategy guides for the games that we have and whether we like the discovery of that. But there are games where I will give strategic tips near the beginning of the game to newer players, because the idea of sharking new players in a game just doesn't make any sense. I'm trying to think of a great example. I know Chain Magnate is one where the first 2 workers that you hire are essential, and some people will make the wrong choice and they'll be close to out of it after 2 turns. But then I've played games with players where they would never offer up any strategic tips under any circumstances, and it's like, well,
that's ridiculous. Yeah, I agree with. I mean, I agree with your take on that. Yeah, I mean, that's winning to the point where you're ruining the game for a person and ruining the enjoyment of the game. Period. That's a different take on it. What my argument is, just you're rewarding the ingenuity and the cleverness of somebody for seeing a strategy is dominant. If somebody can figure it out and see it all the way through and it is proven correctly, I think that deserves a win.
I never want to take that away from a board game.
Sure.
Because, I mean, that's the primary joy of a strategic board game is sort of you feel like you've locked onto a thing that no one else has seen, right? But like, I don't think it should ever be something subtle and overpowered. I think that mix...
But can it not be argued that that is the case in like 90% of games, perhaps?
I mean, I would say subtle but slightly better is where you want to land, right?
Yeah, of course. No,
you don't want to luck into... Well, not luck. You don't want to sort of glean the thing that is going to win the game for you without any competition, right?
Yes. I mean, obviously the best game for me, as defined by what we're saying here, is a game where there is no dominant strategy.
Sure.
You know, all strategies can be. But if there is going to be dominant strategy, I want it to be slightly dominant or slightly overpowered and take a long time to get there.
Yeah. And I agree with that.
I think another interesting subtopic here is strategies that are optimal but unfun and boring. A big example of this is Dominion, which I know has 1,000 expansions now, and I've not played any of the last 5 or 6, but Big Money was a big strategy in the first few expansions where, in a lot of ways, with newbies and with beginner players, you could win by just buying money and not buying any of the action cards in the game. But that is boring as hell. But it was, in fact, and not the most optimal strategy, but it was a good newbie buster strategy. So one thing that I do think about sometimes is that you want the optimal strategies to align with the most fun, quote-unquote, things that you have in the game.
Right. That's an interesting take. I wonder if there are other games like that. That's a hard needle to sort of thread there.
I mean, I think a lot of combat-focused dudes on a map games, you just want to fight people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't reward you for that. Actually, you kind of have talked.
Yeah,
about that
I
before.
do. I mean, it's hard to suss out specific strategies in general, but I do like dudes on map games where you want conflict to be encouraged, where strategies that, again, encourage combat are rewarded. Nothing turns me off of a dudes on the map game more than a game where turtling or playing defensively is rewarded. That's one of the reasons I bounced off of Battle for Rokugan. I feel, I haven't played it enough to know if this is true or not, but my perception of the game is that playing defensively is rewarded, and just that sort of bothered me.
It's one of the reasons I'll always recommend Kemet to people, because it's so offensive forward, as like, if you're not attacking people, you're not winning the game, which, like I said, is a fun way to play while also being the most strategic.
Yeah. So how important is it for you guys to know that a game is mathematically balanced? Like, how important is it for you to know that the designer or the developer of the game has worked the numbers out and calculated in such a way that all the strategies sort of work out?
To me, it's kind of important. It's one of the things I want to believe that every designer does to some extent, like, rather than just going by feel or like, oh, we've play tested this a bunch of times and we don't see any problems. Like, I always want to believe that there's some sort of underlying... Maths is maybe not the right word, but like underlying sort of system of evaluating balance that's built into the game. I know that's not true of every game. I can't imagine it is, at least. But I always want to believe it's been done to some extent.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily vitally important. It depends on the game.
I almost consider it a barrier to entry. My assumption is that they've already done the math. And, you know, if you start a rule book and it says, you know, here's a boring Euro game where you're, you know, in a village and you can either fish or go hunting or build houses or build the church, and you're going to employ those strategies to, you know, great economic success to, you know, to bring
glory to
drab village land, Innsdale. My assumption already, you know, in reading that rule book description, is that I could do any of those things and that I would be rewarded for it.
The numbers have been
It's not like, you know, Mr. Uwe is in the corner like cackling and going like, "Don't you dare go fishing." No.
You idiot.
Yeah. That's a fool's game, Kellen. Right? Like,
yeah, I agree with you. Yes, yeah. It would bother me to know that at least some rigorousness hasn't been devoted to that side of things. Although I do remember reading something or hearing something about some of the math behind Ticket to Ride, sort of surprising mathematicians who were analyzing the game, and they went to Alan Moon and said like, "Oh, why did you do? I forget the specific instance, but why'd you do it this way? We would have expected you to do the scoring this way."
Right.
And
It
he's
was
like,
something about like how the train length corresponds to like each score,
Scoring.
and like there's an obvious way to do it.
Yeah,
and then
and
he was
he did-
like, he was
he's
just
like-
like, it feels better.
Yeah, it
to
felt
me."
better this way. Yeah, and he sold like 7,000 million games, like some obscene number of games just on gut feeling, at least in that avenue of the game. So I guess that's an argument against it.
You know what this makes me think of?
What's that?
That like Mr. Fister or Mr. Lacerda or Uwe or Dr. Reiner have like built in a strategy into their game for like the one ringer game, like
They
10 years
need-
from now.
yeah,
and they pull out this strategy. It's like unbeatable.
That would be so great. God, that'd be so amazing.
Some meeting of the minds tournament,
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. I love that idea. Like your life depended on a thing. You paired the fishing with the hunting? What was that? So that's going to do it for our discussion of strategy and overpowered strategy, broken strategy. And that's also going to do it for the podcast. Before we go, just a reminder that we are going to be both at Gen Con and, as we mentioned earlier, Chuck's in Vancouver this year. Please feel free to contact us either via email at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com or on our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And let us know maybe if you'll be there, if there's any games you'd like us to check out, any designers you'd like us to hit up, any publishers, anything like that whatsoever. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And if we can get things done that you guys want to hear about or see, we would love to do that. And as always, we'd love to game with you if you guys are going to be at either of those conventions.
I also want to put a call out real quick. We'd be interested in doing another episode where we answer your questions via email. So if you have any burning questions for us that you've been just itching to get answers to, please email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com and send your questions in that way, and we'll hope to get them on the future episode of the show.
And as we mentioned earlier, please go ahead and review the show if you like us at Apple Podcasts or Facebook or however wherever you are listening to the show. There's probably an avenue to leave a review. So please go ahead and do so, and you might hear it on the next show. You'll certainly hear it on some subsequent show. So finally, you can find us on any form of social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We're at boardgamebarrage.com. And again, another last call for the Discord, the ever vibrant, ever great to be a part of Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And I think that's going to do it for the show. See ya.
Bye-bye.
So long.
So I'll say before the games we played, and then maybe I'll say kneel and even, and then you just jump in there.
Are you
your shtick.
making my character
That's your
for me?
That's right.
You're telling me
Look
you're
at your
taking
Bible.
notes?
Look at your Bible. That's the Khaled
Read the
character.
script.
Yeah, exactly.
The
Read the
show-
script. Read the script as you always do.
The show notes are for all.
No ad libbing. No ad libbing. You got to play the Kellen character. Okay, so here we go.
And scene.
Oh God, thank you for the obvious end tag right here at the beginning. I love that. That's so good. Okay, here we go.
It would have to be a
Why are
pretty
you
bland
censoring?
person.
He's censoring the
This is
the
Neeling some true colors out of you.
riffraff. Did
Did you see my dragon, Minnie?
that was
Yeah,
cool.
that
That was very cool.
looks nothing like you.
All right, before we move on to our feature topic, let's go ahead and read a review. Oh, that helps. Thanks, Kellen. We're trying to do a professional show here.
Is that your
Take
ringtone?
two.
No, I'm
That should
trying.
be your ringtone. That's my ringtone. Are we ready to be pros?
Yes,
All right. You sure?
I'm ready.
Turn off your phone.
Can I have a second chance?
Okay. Before we move on.